In 2010, CNBC released a documentary called Remington Under Fire that the company tried to bury. It revealed that America's most popular bolt-action rifle had a trigger defect that could fire without anyone touching it. At least 24 people were dead, over 7.5 million rifles were affected, and the company had known about the problem since 1948 but refused to fix it because the solution cost 5.5 cents per gun. But this trigger scandal was just one chapter in a much larger story. We are going to expose how a Wall Street private equity firm systematically destroyed the oldest firearms manufacturer in America and show you what the aftermath reveals about every heritage brand you think you can trust. If you have ever walked into a gun store and seen names like Remington, Marlin, Bushmaster, and DPMS, you probably assumed these were different companies competing to build a better product. That is exactly what they want you to believe. The reality is that starting in 2006, a single private equity firm called Cerberus Capital Management bought all of those brands, merged them into one conglomerate called Freedom Group, and turned America's oldest gunmaker into a debt-fueled cash machine designed to enrich Wall Street investors. When you bought a new Remington 870 or a new Marlin lever action after 2007, you were not buying from the craftsmen who built those brands over generations. You were buying from a subsidiary of a New York hedge fund that had loaded nearly $1 billion in debt onto a company that made shotguns and hunting rifles. Cerberus did not buy Remington to make better guns. They bought it to strip it for parts, and by the time they were done, a company that had been in continuous operation since 1816, a company that armed the Union Army and built sniper systems for the Marine Corps, was bankrupt, broken into pieces, and sold at auction for pennies on the dollar. But here is the part that should concern every American consumer. The playbook Cerberus used on Remington is the exact same playbook being used on dozens of heritage brands you interact with every single day. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what Remington actually was before Wall Street got involved. In 1816, a 23-year-old named Eliphalet Remington forged a rifle barrel from scrap iron at his father's blacksmith shop in Ilion, New York. He walked to a gunsmith in nearby Utica to have it assembled, entered a shooting match, and finished second. But his rifle was so well made that he left with enough orders to start a business. By 1828, he had built a factory on the Erie Canal in Ilion, on the same 100-acre site where Remington would operate for the next 2 centuries. The company supplied rifles for the Civil War, built typewriters that became the Remington Rand Corporation, and exported military arms to over a dozen nations. DuPont bought a controlling stake in 1933 and provided the corporate stability that carried Remington through the Depression and 2 world wars. The products that emerged from that era became legendary. The Model 870 pump-action shotgun, introduced in 1950, became the best-selling shotgun in history with over 11 million produced. The Model 700 bolt-action rifle, introduced in 1962, became the foundation for the Marine Corps M40 sniper system. The Model 1100 semi-automatic shotgun sold over 4 million units. These were not just products. They were American institutions passed down from father to son for generations. When DuPont sold Remington in 1993, the company changed hands through smaller private equity firms but remained functional. The brand was aging, but the factory kept running and the reputation held. That was about to change in ways that nobody in Ilion could have imagined. On May 31, 2007, Cerberus Capital Management closed its acquisition of Remington Arms for $370 million. But Remington was just the centerpiece. Cerberus had already bought Bushmaster the year before, and now the buying spree accelerated. DPMS Panther Arms, Marlin Firearms, and its subsidiary H&R Dakota Arms, Advanced Armament Corporation, Barnes Bullets, Para USA. By 2012, the newly created Freedom Group was the largest gun company in the United States, with 9 plants, over 3,000 employees, and $775 million in annual revenue. Here is how the private equity math works. Cerberus invested approximately $180 million of its own money. The rest was debt piled directly onto Remington and its subsidiaries. The acquired company is literally made to borrow money to pay for its own acquisition. Then in 2013, Cerberus used proceeds from a debt offering to pay itself back through what is called a dividend recapitalization. By 2015, Cerberus had fully recovered its $180 million investment plus an additional $50 million to buy out nervous investors, including the California State Teachers Retirement System, which wanted out of the gun business entirely. The company they left behind was buried under $950 million in debt, and the products that company was making had already started falling apart. The quality collapse was swift, and it touched everything Cerberus owned. They installed cost-cutting managers with zero firearms experience. Production targets went up. Quality control staff went down. Forged metal parts were replaced with cheaper metal injection molded components. And the protective coatings were applied so poorly that brand new Remington 870s were rusting on store shelves still in the box. Gun store employees reported wiping down Remingtons at least twice a week just to keep them presentable. The black oxide finish was so thin that moderate use wore through to bare metal. Classified ads started specifically listing pre-Freedom Group manufacture dates to command premium prices. Think about what that means. The market was telling you that the same model shotgun was worth more money if it was made before the hedge fund took over, but it gets worse. In 2014, Remington launched the R51 pistol, a modernized 9mm that was one of the most anticipated handguns of the year. It was a disaster. Failures to feed, failures to extract, magazines falling out during firing, and one reviewer's hand was actually cut by escaping hot gases. Remington recalled the entire production run. They promised replacements by October of 2014. Those replacements did not ship until June of 2016, over 2 years later. The firearms community's verdict was devastating. One commentator captured it perfectly when he said this once great American brand was killed off by accountants and investors that cared only for the dollar and not the customer. And no brand suffered more than Marlin. Marlin Firearms had been making lever action rifles since 1870, the Model 336, the Model 1895, butter-smooth actions, deep bluing, and quality walnut stocks, all produced by experienced workers at their factory in North Haven, Connecticut. When Cerberus acquired Marlin in 2008, they closed the North Haven plant and moved everything to Remington's facility in Ilion. 265 employees lost their jobs. Remington refused to pay moving expenses and offered pay cuts to anyone willing to relocate. The result was that reportedly not a single North Haven worker made the move. Over a century of institutional knowledge walked out the door. The Ilion workers who inherited the machinery had never built a lever action rifle in their lives. The guns that came off the line were catastrophic. Misaligned sights, canted barrels, actions so rough they felt like grinding sand. Poorly heat-treated screws that snapped during routine disassembly. The firearms community invented a new word for these guns. They called them Remlins, a Remington ruined Marlin. Collectors started checking barrel stamps. If it said JM for John Marlin, it was the real thing. If it said REP for Remington produced, many dealers would not even stock it. Now remember that trigger defect from the opening of this video. That story gets even darker when you learn the full timeline. In 1947, Remington engineer Mike Walker designed the trigger mechanism for the Model 721 rifle. Internal documents from that same year described the trigger connector as very dangerous. Walker himself proposed a safer design in 1948. Remington rejected it because it would have cost 5.5 cents more per gun. That defective design was carried forward into the Model 700 in 1962 and installed in over 7.5 million firearms across multiple models. For decades, these rifles could fire when the safety was switched off or when the bolt was manipulated with no trigger pull whatsoever. Remington received over 10,000 written complaints. At least 24 people died. The company considered a recall in 1979 and rejected it. They considered another in 1994 and rejected it again. When CNBC tracked down 98-year-old Mike Walker himself for the documentary, he confirmed on camera that his safer design had been rejected to save pennies. Remington finally recalled 1.3 million rifles in 2014 for a related trigger defect in their newer X-Mark Pro system. A class action settlement in 2018 covered all 7.5 million affected guns with the original Walker trigger. But when Remington dissolved in 2020, those recall and replacement programs effectively died with it, leaving millions of potentially defective rifles in American homes with no manufacturer standing behind them. Remington filed for bankruptcy on March 25, 2018, listing $950 million in debt. The company emerged in just 2 months after creditors converted $775 million in debt to equity, and Cerberus lost control. But the damage was too deep. Revenue collapsed to $437 million in 2019, roughly half of what it had been just 3 years earlier. The second bankruptcy came on July 27, 2020. This time there would be no restructuring. The company was auctioned off in pieces. Vista Outdoor bought the ammunition business for $81.4 million. Sturm Ruger won Marlin for $28.3 million. A group called Roundhill bought the entire firearms operation and the historic Ilion factory for just $13 million. Think about that number. The factory where Eliphalet Remington forged his first rifle barrel, the facility that armed the Union in the Civil War, the plant that built Marine Corps sniper systems, was sold for $13 million. That is less than the price of a few houses in most American suburbs. Total auction proceeds came to roughly $155 million against nearly $1 billion in original debt. Cerberus, which had already extracted its investment years earlier, lost nothing. The Ilion factory closed permanently on March 4, 2024. 300 final jobs eliminated. The town of Ilion, population 7,646, lost the identity it had carried for 2 centuries. This was a town where 3 generations of the same family worked the same factory floor. At its peak, Remington employed 3,000 people in Ilion. By the end, it was 300. The village now faces nearly $1 million in annual lost tax revenue, roughly $600 per household that has to come from somewhere. The 34-acre factory complex, once the beating heart of the community, sits empty. The Remington sign was removed from the building in November of that year. The mayor said it plainly. He said Ilion is Remington, and Remington is Ilion. If you are 100 years old and still alive, you have never known that building as anything but Remington. But here is the detail that should make your blood boil. Ruger bought the destroyed Marlin brand for $28.3 million. They moved over 100 truckloads of equipment to their plant in Mayodan, North Carolina. And then they did something that Cerberus never once attempted in 13 years of ownership. They took their time. They completely re-engineered production with modern CNC machining, cold hammer forged barrels, and rigorous quality control. Rather than rushing product to market, they spent a full year before shipping the first rifle. The first Ruger made Marlin, serial number RM0001001, shipped on September 30th, 2021. Outdoor Life reviewed it and declared it the best factory-made lever action in the company's entire history. Ruger's CEO chose not to put the Ruger name on the rifles. He said they were very proud of the Marlin brand and its history. Ruger proved that the knowledge of how to make great guns was never lost. Cerberus simply chose not to pay for it. The Remington story is not unique. It is a template. Buy a beloved brand, load it with debt, cut the quality, extract the cash, let it collapse, and walk away before the bill comes due. It is happening right now to heritage brands across every industry in America. So the next time you pick up a product with a name you trust, do not assume that the company behind it is the same one that earned your loyalty. Check the ownership, check the acquisition dates, and never underestimate how quickly Wall Street can destroy 200 years of American craftsmanship to make a quarterly earnings target. If you found this story as infuriating as we did, hit subscribe for more stories like this one.